I was just 7 years old when I learned what real courage looks like, and it didn't come from a superhero or a soldier. It came from a girl with worn-out shoes and a backpack held together by safety pins. But what she did that day left an entire room of adults speechless, and I've never forgotten it since. Before we continue, if stories like this inspire you, subscribe to the channel now, so you don't miss the next ones. My name is Emma, and back in second grade, I lived in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone, and not always in a good way. My school was one of those old brick buildings with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew too hard. Most of the kids came from families that had enough, but there were a few of us who came from homes where enough was a luxury we only dreamed about. I was one of those kids. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and my dad had left us when I was 4. I wore the same 3 outfits on rotation, and my lunch was usually a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a paper towel because we couldn't afford sandwich bags. But the girl I'm about to tell you about, her name was Sophia, and she had it even harder than me. Sophia lived with her grandmother in a trailer park on the edge of town. Her grandmother cleaned houses for a living, and Sophia wore clothes that were so faded you could barely make out what color they used to be. Her shoes had holes in them, and in the winter, you could see her toes peeking through. The other kids whispered about her. They called her names. They made fun of the way she smelled sometimes, like the cheap soap from the dollar store, or how her lunch was always just crackers and an apple. I never joined in on the teasing, but I never stopped it either. I was too scared, too worried that if I stood up for Sophia, they'd turn on me next. So I stayed quiet, and I've regretted that silence more times than I can count. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and our teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had organized a parent-teacher meeting in the gymnasium. It wasn't a regular one-on-one meeting. It was one of those big community gatherings where all the parents sat in folding chairs. And a few teachers stood at the front talking about school policies, fundraising events, and upcoming projects. I remember the gym smelled like floor wax and stale popcorn from some event the night before. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and there must have been at least 60 or 70 people packed into that space. Sophia sat in the back row with her grandmother, a tiny woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. I sat a few rows ahead with my mom, who had managed to get off work early that day. I could feel my mom's exhaustion radiating off her. She kept rubbing her eyes and checking her watch, probably calculating how many hours of sleep she'd get before her night shift started. Everything was going fine until they got to the part about the upcoming fall festival. The PTA president, a woman named Mrs. Callahan, stood up and started talking about how they needed volunteers and donations. Mrs. Callahan was one of those women who always looked perfect. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect smile. She lived in one of the big houses on Maple Street, the kind with the manicured lawns and the 2-car garages. Her son, Tyler, was in our grade, and he was one of the worst when it came to picking on Sophia. Mrs. Callahan went on and on about how the festival was a tradition, how it brought the community together, and how important it was for every family to contribute. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. She said that each family was expected to donate at least $25 or volunteer for at least 10 hours. And if you couldn't do either, well, maybe your priorities weren't in the right place. I saw Sophia's grandmother shift in her seat. I saw the way her hands gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles turning white. And I knew, just like Sophia probably knew, that $25 might as well have been $250 for them. 10 hours of volunteer time meant 10 hours that Sophia's grandmother couldn't be cleaning houses, which meant 10 hours of lost income they couldn't afford to lose. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Another parent, a man named Mr. Hendricks, stood up. He was a tall guy with a booming voice, the kind of person who always seemed to take up more space than he needed. He owned a car dealership in town and drove a brand new truck that he parked right in front of the school every time he came by, like he wanted everyone to see it. Mr. Hendricks cleared his throat and said, with this smug smile on his face, that he appreciated Mrs. Callahan's passion for the community, but he wanted to add something. He said that the festival wasn't just about raising money, it was about raising the right kind of money. He said that the school had a reputation to uphold, And that meant making sure that the families who represented the school were families who could actually contribute something meaningful. I didn't fully understand what he was getting at, but the adults around me did. I could see it in the way some of them nodded, and others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My mom leaned forward, her jaw tight, and then Mr. Hendricks said it outright. He said that maybe it was time to have an honest conversation about whether every family belonged at events like these, especially families who couldn't pull their weight. The room went silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. And that's when Sophia stood up. This tiny 7-year-old girl with tangled hair and a dress that was 2 sizes too big stood up in front of all those adults and looked Mr. Hendricks right in the eye. I don't think anyone expected her to say anything. I don't think anyone even thought she had the courage to, but she did. And what she said next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. Sophia's voice was small at first, shaky, but it carried across the room because everyone had gone so quiet. She said, "I don't have $25 to give. My grandma and I have enough for food some weeks, but I come to school every day. I do my homework. I try to be kind to people even when they're not kind to me. And I don't think that makes me less than anyone else here." I could see Mr. Hendricks' face turn red. I could see Mrs. Callahan's perfect smile falter. And I could see Sophia's grandmother sitting there with tears streaming down her face. Not from shame, but from pride. Pride that her granddaughter had the strength to stand up when no one else would. But Sophia wasn't done. She looked around the room, at all the parents and teachers staring at her, and she said, "My friend Emma, she doesn't have a lot either, but she's smart and she's brave, even when she doesn't think she is. And there are other kids like us, kids who might not have fancy clothes or new backpacks, but we show up, we try, and maybe that should count for something too." I felt my face burn. I felt my chest tighten, because she called me brave, and I knew I wasn't. I hadn't stood up for her. I hadn't said a word, but she still called me her friend. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was something heavier. Guilt, maybe, or shame. One by one, people started to look away. They couldn't meet Sophia's eyes. They couldn't meet each other's eyes. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone started clapping. It was a slow clap at first. Then another person joined in, and another, until about half the room was applauding. Not everyone. Mr. Hendricks sat down with his arms crossed, his face still red. Mrs. Callahan looked like she wanted to disappear. But enough people clapped that it meant something. Mrs. Patterson, our teacher, stood up and walked over to Sophia. She knelt down so she was at Sophia's level, and she said, "Thank you for your honesty, Sophia. You're absolutely right. Contribution isn't just about money. It's about heart, and you have more of that than most people in this room." I wanted to stand up too. I wanted to walk over to Sophia and tell her I was sorry. Sorry for all the times I stayed quiet. Sorry for not being the friend she deserved. But I was frozen. I just sat there, tears running down my face, while my mom squeezed my hand so tight it almost hurt. The meeting ended shortly after that. People shuffled out of the gym, some of them stopping to talk to Sophia's grandmother, offering apologies or words of encouragement. Others left quickly, avoiding eye contact. I saw Mr. Hendricks storm out, without saying another word. Mrs. Callahan tried to save face by announcing that the festival would have a sliding scale for donations, but her voice was shaky, and no one seemed to care anymore. I finally found the courage to walk over to Sophia as everyone was leaving. She was standing with her grandmother, who was wiping her eyes with a tissue. I didn't know what to say, so I just said, "You were really brave today, braver than I've ever been." Sophia looked at me with those big brown eyes and she smiled, just a little. She said, "It's okay, Emma. I was scared too, but someone had to say something." And I thought, if no one else will, then I will. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head. I kept thinking about how a 7-year-old girl had more courage than a room full of grown adults. How she stood up not just for herself, but for me, for all of us who felt invisible. And I made myself a promise. I promised that I would never stay silent like that again. That I would never let someone like Mr. Hendricks make people feel small just because they didn't have money. The next day at school, something had changed. Kids who used to ignore Sophia started saying hi to her in the hallways. A few of them even sat with her at lunch. It wasn't a huge transformation, but it was something. And for the first time since I'd known her, Sophia didn't eat alone. I sat with her too. And we didn't talk about what happened at the meeting. We just talked about normal second grade stuff, like our favorite cartoons and how much we hated long division. But the story doesn't end there, because what Sophia did that day rippled out further than any of us realized at the time. Mrs. Patterson started a program at our school called Everyone Contribute. It was a system where kids could volunteer in different ways, helping out in the library, organizing supplies, tutoring younger students, things like that. And those contributions counted just as much as monetary donations. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was a way of saying that everyone had value, no matter what their bank account looked like. And me, I started speaking up more, not just about big things, but about small things too. When I saw someone being left out, I invited them to join. When I heard someone making fun of another kid, I told them to stop. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes people didn't like it. Sometimes they called me names too. But I remembered Sophia standing in that gym, her voice shaking but her words strong. And I knew that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. Years later, when I was in high school, I ran into Sophia's grandmother at the grocery store. Sophia had moved away by then. Her grandmother had gotten a better job in another town and had left when we were in 5th grade. But her grandmother remembered me. She hugged me right there in the cereal aisle and told me that Sophia was doing well, that she was in high school too, on the honor roll, and part of the debate team. And then she said something that made me cry right there in public. She said, "Sophia always talks about that day at the meeting. She says it taught her that her voice matters, no matter how small she feels. And she wanted me to thank you, Emma, for sitting with her afterward, for being her friend when it mattered most." I don't know if I deserved that thanks. I still think I could have done more. I should have stood up with her that day, instead of waiting until after. But I've carried that moment with me ever since. It taught me that courage doesn't always look like what we think it should. Sometimes it's not about being the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes it's just about standing up when everyone else is sitting down. About speaking truth when silence would be easier. About defending someone who can't defend themselves, even when you're scared of what it might cost you. Sophia was 7 years old, and she taught an entire room of adults what it means to have dignity, what it means to stand up for yourself and for others. And she did it without raising her voice, without being cruel, without tearing anyone else down. She just told the truth. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing you can do. I wish I could say that everything changed overnight after that meeting, but real life doesn't work that way. The truth is, change happens slowly, like water wearing down stone. Some people got it right away, others never did, and some, like Mr. Hendricks, just pretended it never happened at all. The week after Sophia stood up in that gymnasium, I noticed small things shifting at school. The cafeteria lady, Mrs. Rodriguez, started giving Sophia extra portions at lunch without saying anything about it. She'd just pile a little more mashed potatoes on her tray, add an extra cookie, and wink. Sophia's face would light up every time, and Mrs. Rodriguez would pretend like it was completely normal, like she did that for everyone. But she didn't. I watched. She only did it for the kids she knew needed it most. Tyler Callahan, the kid whose mom had been up there talking about donations and contributions. He stopped picking on Sophia. He didn't become her best friend or anything dramatic like that, but he stopped. And in 2nd grade, that was huge. I remember one day in the hallway, another kid tried to trip Sophia as she walked past, and Tyler actually said something. He said, "Knock it off, man. Just leave her alone." The kid looked shocked. I was shocked, but Tyler just shrugged and kept walking. Maybe his mom had talked to him after the meeting. Maybe he'd felt embarrassed by the whole thing. I don't know. But whatever the reason, he stopped being part of the problem. My mom changed too, in ways I didn't fully understand until I was older. She started volunteering at the school once a month, even though it meant losing hours at her second job. She'd come in and help Mrs. Patterson organize the classroom library, or make copies of worksheets or supervise recess. And I'd see her talking to other parents, the ones who looked tired like she did, the ones who wore the same clothes multiple times a week, the ones who drove old cars held together with prayer and duct tape. She'd exchange phone numbers with them, share information about food banks or community resources, or which thrift stores had the best deals on kids' clothes. She was building a network, the quiet support system for families like ours. Families who were struggling, but too proud or too scared to ask for help. If this story has already moved you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because there are other real and emotional stories you can't miss. But not everyone was on board with this new reality. Mr. Hendricks, he doubled down on his stand. I heard from other kids that he'd started a petition to change the school's policy on fee waivers and reduced lunch programs. He argued that the school was enabling families to be dependent on handouts, instead of encouraging them to work harder. He got maybe 15 signatures out of a school of 300 families, but he was loud about it. He'd corner other parents in the parking lot, trying to get them to see his side. Most people just nodded politely and walked away, but a few agreed with him, enough that it made things uncomfortable for a while. Sophia's grandmother heard about the petition. I don't know how, maybe someone told her, maybe she overheard something, but she heard. And I was terrified that Sophia would have to stand up again, that this tiny girl would have to keep fighting battles that adults should have been fighting for her, that this time she didn't have to, because this time other people stood up first. Mrs. Patterson wrote a letter to the school board. I know this because my mom was one of the people who helped her write it. They sat at our kitchen table one night, my mom's laptop open between them, typing and retyping sentences until they got them just right. I sat in the living room pretending to watch TV, but really I was listening to every word. Mrs. Patterson's letter talked about dignity and equity and how education was supposed to be the great equalizer, not another system that punished people for being poor. She talked about Sophia, though she didn't use her name. She called her a brave young student who reminded us all what courage really looks like. And she said that if the adults in the room couldn't learn from a 7-year-old's example, then maybe they needed to reevaluate their own values. The letter got read at the next school board meeting. Mr. Hendricks was there. So was Mrs. Callahan. So were a bunch of other parents, including my mom and Sophia's grandmother. I wasn't there. I was too young to attend, but my mom told me all about it afterward. She said the room was tense, that Mr. Hendricks tried to argue his case, that he stood up and said the same things he'd said at the parent meeting. But this time, he didn't have a room full of silent, uncomfortable people. This time, people spoke back. A dad whose daughter was in my class stood up and said he'd lost his job 6 months ago, and if it weren't for the reduced lunch program, his kids would have gone hungry at school. A mom whose son had special needs talked about how the fee waivers for extracurricular activities were the only reason her kid could participate in anything. Another parent, a single father who worked construction, said that he was teaching his son to work hard, but that didn't mean his son should be punished or humiliated because their family was struggling. One by one, people shared their stories, and with each story, Mr. Hendricks seemed to shrink a little bit in his seat. By the end of the meeting, the school board voted unanimously to not only keep the existing programs, but to expand them. They created a fund specifically for families who needed help with school supplies, field trips, and extracurricular fees. They made it anonymous, so no one had to publicly admit they needed help. They just worked with the teachers and the front office to identify kids who might benefit, and then quietly made sure those kids had what they needed. When my mom came home that night, she looked exhausted but lighter somehow. She told me what happened, and then she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Emma, that little girl, Sophia, she started something. She stood up when she was scared, and because she did, other people found the courage to stand up too. That's how change happens. One person decides they've had enough, and then another person decides the same, and then another, until suddenly there's a whole group of people who refuse to stay silent anymore." I thought about that a lot. I thought about how Sophia probably had no idea what would happen when she stood up that day. She wasn't trying to start a movement or change school policy, or inspire a bunch of adults to tell their stories. She was just tired of being treated like she didn't matter. She was just defending herself and me, and all the other kids who felt invisible. But her honesty, her raw truth, it created a ripple effect that went further than any of us could have imagined. At school, things continued to shift. The Everyone Contributes program that Mrs. Patterson started became really popular. Kids loved it because they got to help out in ways that made them feel important. The kindergarteners needed reading buddies, so some of us older kids would go sit with them once a week and read stories. The school garden needed tending, so a group of students volunteered to water plants and pull weeds during recess. The library needed books organized. The art room needed supplies sorted. The front office needed someone to run papers between classes. There were a million little tasks that kept a school running, and now kids were part of making that happen. And the best part, it wasn't divided by who had money and who didn't. Everyone participated. The kids from the big houses on Maple Street were working side by side with kids from the trailer park. We were all contributing in whatever way we could, and no one's contribution was seen as more valuable than anyone else's. For the first time, I felt like we were actually a community, not just a collection of families divided by income brackets. Sophia thrived in that environment. She volunteered everywhere. She helped in the library. She tutored first graders in reading. She organized the art supplies. She even helped Mrs. Rodriguez in the cafeteria sometimes, wiping down tables and stacking trays. She was everywhere, always helping, always smiling, and people noticed. Teachers started praising her, not because they felt sorry for her, but because she genuinely was one of the most helpful, hard-working students in the school. I tried to follow her example. I signed up to be a reading buddy for the kindergartners, and I loved it. There was this one little boy named Marcus who struggled with his letters, and every week I'd sit with him and we'd practice together. By the end of the year, he could read a whole book by himself, and when he finished it, he looked up at me with this huge smile and said, "I did it." And I felt this swell of pride, like I'd actually made a difference in someone's life. It was a small difference, sure, but it mattered to Marcus, and that made it matter to me. But even with all the positive changes, there were still hard days. There were still moments when someone would make a comment about Sophia's clothes or her shoes, or the fact that she never had money for the book fair. There were still times when I'd see her sitting alone at recess, not because no one would play with her, but because she'd withdrawn into herself, tired of having to prove her worth over and over again. I'd go sit with her on those days. We wouldn't always talk. Sometimes we'd just sit there in silence, watching the other kids play, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But the silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was companionable. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without needing words. Third grade came, and with it came new challenges. We got a new teacher, Mr. Williams, and he wasn't like Mrs. Patterson. He was strict, old-fashioned, and he didn't seem to understand or care about the Everyone Contributes program. He believed in traditional grades and traditional merit, and he made it clear from day one that excuses wouldn't fly in his classroom. If you didn't have your homework, you got a 0. If you were late, you got detention. If you didn't have the right supplies, that was your problem to figure out. For kids like Sophia and me, this was terrifying. There were days when I didn't have the right notebook or the right kind of pencil because we couldn't afford to buy new supplies every time the teacher requested something specific. There were days when Sophia came to school without her homework done because she'd spent the evening taking care of her grandmother, who'd been sick. Mr. Williams didn't want to hear explanations. He just marked us down and moved on. I watched Sophia's confidence start to crumble. The girl who had stood up in front of a room full of adults now sat hunched over her desk, trying to make herself as small as possible. She stopped volunteering for everything. She stopped raising her hand in class. She stopped smiling. And it broke my heart because I knew it was because she was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of proving herself. Tired of being punished for circumstances beyond her control. One day in late October, almost exactly a year after the parent meeting, Mr. Williams assigned us a project. We had to create a family tree going back at least 3 generations, complete with photos and written descriptions of each family member. It was worth 20% of our grade. For some kids, this was easy. They had boxes of old photos at home, stories their grandparents told them, clear lineages they could trace back with ease. For Sophia, it was impossible. She didn't have photos. Her mom had left when she was a baby. Her dad was never in the picture. and her grandmother rarely talked about the past. Sophia had no way to complete this project the way Mr. Williams wanted it done. I knew this because she told me during recess, her voice shaking, tears threatening to spill over. She said she'd talked to Mr. Williams, asked if she could do something different, maybe write about a historical figure's family tree instead. But he'd said no. The assignment was the assignment, and if she couldn't do it, she'd fail. I went home that night and told my mom what was happening. My mom's face hardened in a way I'd only seen a few times before. She said, "That's not right, Emma. That's not fair, and I'm not going to let it stand." The next day, she took off work and went to the school. She didn't just talk to Mr. Williams. She went straight to the principal's office and demanded a meeting with both of them. I wasn't there, but later my mom told me what she said. She told them that the assignment was discriminatory, that it assumed every child came from a stable, documented family with resources and history readily available. She pointed out that there were kids in that classroom who were adopted, kids in foster care, kids being raised by relatives, kids whose families had fled other countries and lost everything in the process. She said that education should be about learning, not about showcasing privilege. And she said that if the school didn't address this, she'd bring it to the school board again. And this time she wouldn't be alone. The principal, Mr. Vasquez, was a reasonable man. He'd been at that parent meeting the year before. He'd seen what happened when the school ignored the needs of its most vulnerable students. He told Mr. Williams that the assignment needed to be modified. Students could choose to do a traditional family tree, or they could create a family tree for a historical figure, or they could do a project about what family means to them, with drawings and writings instead of photos. Mr. Williams wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. Sophia chose to write about what family meant to her. She wrote about her grandmother, about how they didn't have much, but they had each other. She wrote about the cafeteria lady who gave her extra food. She wrote about Mrs. Patterson, who'd stood up for her. She wrote about me, calling me the sister she never had. And she drew pictures to go with it. Simple colored pencil drawings of all the people who made up her chosen family. When she presented it to the class, more than half the kids were crying. Even Mr. Williams looked uncomfortable, like maybe he was realizing for the first time that his rigid rules had real consequences for real kids. Sophia got an A on that project. But more than that, she got her confidence back. She started raising her hand again. She started volunteering again. She started smiling again. And I learned another important lesson. Sometimes courage isn't just about standing up once. Sometimes it's about getting back up every time you're knocked down. It's about refusing to let the world make you small, even when the world keeps trying. The years that followed taught me that standing up for what's right isn't a one-time thing. It's a choice you make over and over again, sometimes every single day. And Sophia, she kept making that choice, even when it would have been easier to just blend in and stay quiet. By fourth grade, something unexpected happened. Sophia's grandmother got a promotion. She'd been cleaning houses for years, but one of her clients, a woman who owned a small hotel downtown, offered her a job as the head of housekeeping. It came with benefits, a steady paycheck, and even health insurance. For the first time in Sophia's life, they had a little bit of breathing room. Not a lot, but enough that Sophia came to school with new shoes that actually fit, with a backpack that didn't need safety pins, with lunch that included more than just crackers and an apple. Some kids thought this meant Sophia's struggles were over. They thought that now she could relax, that she'd finally be like everyone else. But Sophia didn't see it that way. If anything, having a little more made her even more aware of the kids who had less. She started noticing things I'd never paid attention to, like how Jacob, a quiet kid who sat in the back of every class, wore the same shirt 3 days in a row. Or how Maria never bought anything from the school fundraisers, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't afford it. Or how these two brothers, Danny and Chris, shared one calculator between them for math class, passing it back and forth depending on whose turn it was to do problems at the board. Sophia started doing something about it. She'd bring extra snacks to school and leave them in kids' desks when they weren't looking. She'd find quarters on the ground, she claimed, and give them to kids who needed lunch money. She'd organize swaps where kids could trade clothes or school supplies they didn't need anymore for things they did need. She never made a big deal out of it. She never announced what she was doing. She just quietly made sure that the kids who were struggling, the kids she recognized because she'd been one of them, had a little bit more than they did before. I helped her when I could. My mom's situation had improved too, not as dramatically as Sophia's grandmother's, but enough that we weren't constantly on the edge anymore. My mom had gotten a better job at a medical office, which meant she could quit her second job and actually be home in the evenings. We still shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons and watched every penny, but we weren't drowning anymore. We were treading water, and sometimes that's all you need to catch your breath and keep going. One afternoon in late spring, Sophia and I were walking home from school together like we did most days. We'd developed this routine where we'd take the long way, cutting through the park and stopping at the playground, even though we were probably too old for it. We'd sit on the swings and talk about everything and nothing, our feet dragging in the dirt, the chains creaking above us. That day, Sophia was quieter than usual. I could tell something was on her mind, so I waited. I'd learned that with Sophia, you didn't push. You just gave her space, and eventually she'd open up when she was ready. After about 10 minutes of silence, she finally spoke. She said, "My grandma's been talking about moving. Her boss offered her a manager position at another hotel, but it's 2 hours away. Better pay, better opportunities, all that stuff. We'd have to leave before 5th grade starts." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Sophia was my best friend, my partner in everything. The idea of her leaving, of going to school without her, of not having her there to understand all the things no one else seemed to get, it was unbearable. I asked her if she wanted to go, and she shrugged. She said, "I don't know. Part of me wants to stay here because this is home, you know? This is where everything happened. This is where I learned to stand up for myself. But another part of me thinks maybe it would be good to start over somewhere new, somewhere where people don't know me as the poor kid who stood up at that meeting." I understood what she meant, even though it hurt. Sometimes your reputation follows you around like a shadow, even when it's a good reputation. People had started calling Sophia inspirational, which sounds nice, but it also meant that every time she did something normal, like get a bad grade on a test or get in trouble for talking in class, people were surprised. Like, she was supposed to be perfect all the time just because she'd been brave once. That's a lot of pressure for anyone, especially a 9-year-old kid. We sat there swinging in silence for a while longer, and then Sophia said something that changed my perspective on everything. She said, "You know what I've been thinking about? That meeting, the one where I stood up. I used to think that was the most important thing I ever did, and maybe it was. But lately I've been thinking that what came after was just as important. Like, standing up that one time was brave, but showing up every day after that, even when people expected things from me, even when it was hard, that took courage too. Different kind of courage, but still courage." She was right. I'd been so focused on that one dramatic moment in the gymnasium that I'd almost forgotten about all the small moments that came after. The way Sophia helped other kids without making a big deal out of it. The way she kept trying even when teachers like Mr. Williams made it harder than it needed to be. The way she stayed kind even when the world hadn't always been kind to her. That was courage too. Quiet, persistent, daily courage. I told her that no matter where she went, she'd carry that courage with her. And I told her that I'd learned from watching her, that she'd taught me how to be brave in my own way. She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes, and she said, "You were always brave, Emma. You just didn't know it yet. But I saw it in you from the beginning." Sophia and her grandmother did end up moving that summer. I helped them pack, spending long afternoons in their small trailer, wrapping dishes in newspaper and taping up boxes. Sophia's grandmother kept thanking me, kept saying how much my friendship had meant to Sophia, how having someone in her corner had made all the difference. I wanted to tell her that it worked both ways, that Sophia had been in my corner too, but I was too busy trying not to cry to get the words out. The day they left, my mom drove me to their new place to help them unload. It was a small apartment, but it was nicer than the trailer. It had heat that worked, windows that closed properly, and a kitchen with a full-size refrigerator. Sophia showed me her room, which was barely bigger than a closet, but it was hers, and she was so excited about it. She'd already started putting up posters and arranging her few books on a little shelf. She said, "It's weird, you know? Having a door that closes. Having a space that's just mine. I've always shared a room with my grandma. This feels like luxury." I stayed for dinner that night. Sophia's grandmother made rice and beans and chicken, and we all sat around their tiny kitchen table talking about the new school Sophia would be going to, the new neighborhood, the new start. Before we left, Sophia walked me outside to say goodbye. We stood there on the sidewalk, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, she hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you for sitting with me that day, after the meeting. You didn't have to, but you did. And that mattered more than you know." I hugged her back, tears streaming down my face, and I said, "Thank you for standing up, for all of us. You changed everything." We promised to write letters, to call when we could, to stay friends no matter what, and we did for a while. The letters came regularly at first, then less frequently, as we both got busy with new schools and new friends and new lives. But even as the letters slowed down and eventually stopped, I never forgot Sophia. I never forgot what she taught me. And I never stopped trying to live up to the examples she set. 5th grade without Sophia was hard. I felt her absence every day, like a missing piece of myself I couldn't quite get back. But I also felt her presence in the choices I made. When I saw a new kid eating alone at lunch, I sat with them, remembering all the times Sophia had eaten alone. When a teacher assigned something that seemed unfair or discriminatory, I spoke up, remembering how my mom had advocated for Sophia. When someone made fun of another kid for not having the right clothes or the right supplies, I told them to stop, remembering every cruel word that had been thrown at Sophia over the years. I wasn't alone in this. Other kids who'd been at that school during the meeting, kids who'd watched Sophia stand up to adults twice her size, they carried that lesson forward too. We became a generation of students who refused to let people be invisible. We looked out for each other in ways that the older kids never had. We shared what we had. We stood up when we saw something wrong. We made sure everyone knew they mattered. The Everyone Contributes program expanded. By the time I was in middle school, it had spread to other schools in the district. Kids were volunteering in all kinds of ways, and the program had created this culture where helping out wasn't seen as charity. It was just what you did. It was how you were part of the community. And because of that, fewer kids fell through the cracks. Fewer kids went hungry, or felt left out, or believed they were less than because they had less than. But the impact went beyond just our school district. Mrs. Patterson, who'd started the program, she ended up presenting it at education conferences. Other schools and other states started implementing similar initiatives. And at every presentation, she told Sophia's story. She talked about the 7-year-old girl who stood up in a gymnasium and reminded a room full of adults what dignity looked like. She talked about how one moment of courage had sparked a movement that was still growing years later. She never used Sophia's real name, always protected her privacy, but she made sure people knew that sometimes the most important voices are the ones we're most likely to overlook. I went to middle school, then high school, and with each passing year, the memory of that meeting became both more distant and more clear. Distant because time moved on, because new things happened and life got more complicated, but more clear because I understood it better. I understood what it had taken for Sophia to stand up that day. I understood the weight of the silence that had come before her words. I understood why some adults had clapped and others had looked away. I understood that change is uncomfortable, that it requires people to confront their own biases and privileges and blind spots. And I understood that most people won't do that unless someone forces them to. Sophia forced them to. This tiny girl in a too big dress with holes in her shoes. She forced an entire room of people to look at themselves and question whether they were living up to their own values. And most importantly, she did it without hatred or bitterness or cruelty. She did it with simple, honest truth. She said, "I'm here. I matter. And so do all the other kids like me." And that truth was so powerful, so undeniable, that people had no choice but to listen. In high school, I became involved in student government. I ran for class representative on a platform of equity and inclusion. Ideas I probably wouldn't have even known to care about if it weren't for Sophia. I pushed for free menstrual products in school bathrooms. I advocated for expanded free lunch programs. I organized donation drives for school supplies and winter coats. And every time someone asked me why I cared so much about these issues, I thought about Sophia. I thought about the girl who taught me that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it just tells the truth when everyone else is too afraid to. I also kept tabs on Sophia, even though we'd lost touch directly. Through social media and mutual acquaintances and the occasional update from Mrs. Patterson, who'd stayed in contact with Sophia's grandmother, I heard bits and pieces of her life. She was doing well. She'd made the honor roll every semester. She'd joined the debate team and won regional competitions. She'd started a club at her new school that paired students who had resources with students who needed them, kind of like what she'd done informally at our school, but more organized. She was still being Sophia, still standing up, still making sure people didn't fall through the cracks. And then, in my junior year of high school, something happened that brought everything full circle. Our school was hosting a leadership conference for students from around the state, and one of the keynote speakers was a college student who'd started a nonprofit focused on educational equity. The conference organizers put her name and photo up on posters around the school, and the moment I saw it, my heart stopped. It was Sophia. Older, of course, probably around 19 or 20, but unmistakably her. Same brown eyes, same determined expression, same presence that commanded attention without demanding it. I signed up to attend the conference immediately. I didn't tell anyone why I was so excited, didn't explain to my friends that I knew the speaker personally. I just marked it on my calendar and counted down the days. When the conference finally arrived, I sat in the front row of the auditorium, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen Sophia in almost 7 years. I didn't know if she'd remember me. I didn't know what I'd say if I got the chance to talk to her. I just knew I had to be there. Sophia walked onto the stage, and the room fell silent. She was poised, confident, wearing a simple blazer and jeans, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She smiled at the audience, thanked the organizers for inviting her, and then she started her speech. She said, "When I was 7 years old, I stood up in front of a room full of adults and told them I mattered. I told them that being poor didn't make me less valuable, less worthy of respect, less deserving of an education. I was terrified. My voice shook. I thought they might laugh at me or ignore me or tell me to sit down and be quiet. But I spoke anyway, because I realized that if I didn't speak, nothing would change. And I was tired of waiting for things to change." She went on to talk about what had happened after that meeting, how the school had created new programs, how other students had found their own courage to speak up, how small actions had created ripples that turned into waves. And then she said something that made me cry right there in the front row. She said, "But I didn't do it alone. There was a girl who sat with me afterward when I was shaking and scared and didn't know if I'd done the right thing. She didn't make a big speech. She didn't stand up with me, though I wish she had because maybe that would have been easier. But what she did was just as important. She saw me. She sat with me. She stayed. And that reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were people who cared, even if they were scared too. And sometimes, that's all you need to keep going." After the speech, there was a Q&A session, and then a meet and greet. I waited in line, my hands shaking, rehearsing what I'd say. When I finally got to the front, Sophia looked up at me, and for a second, there was no recognition. Then her eyes widened. She said my name like a question, "Emma?" And I nodded, tears already streaming down my face. She came around the table and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She said, "Oh my God, Emma, I can't believe you're here. I was talking about you in that speech. You were the girl who sat with me. You were the one who stayed." We talked for almost an hour after everyone else had left. We caught up on everything, filled in all the gaps the letters had left. She told me about college, about her non-profit, about how that one moment in the gymnasium had shaped her entire life's trajectory. She said she studied social work now, that she wanted to spend her life advocating for kids who are invisible, who were overlooked, who were told they didn't matter. And I told her about student government, about the programs I'd pushed for, about how she'd inspired me to never stay silent again. We cried and laughed and marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Before we parted ways, Sophia said something I'll carry with me forever. She said, people always want to make that meeting into this big dramatic moment. Like, I was some kind of hero or something. But the truth is, I was just a scared kid who was tired of being treated like I didn't exist. The real heroism, the real courage, that came from everyone who chose to do something after. Your mom who went to the school board, Mrs. Patterson who started that program, the other parents who shared their stories. You, sitting with me when I felt alone. All of those actions, they mattered just as much as my words. Maybe more, because actions are what create lasting change. If this story has touched you, subscribe to the channel and comment below which part moved you most. And before you go, there's a recommended video right next to this one that will give you chills. Watch it now. She was right, of course. One voice can start something, but it takes many voices, many actions, many people choosing courage over comfort to make real change happen. Sophia had been the spark, but all of us, we'd been the fire. And that fire was still burning, still spreading, still lighting the way for others. Have you ever judged someone and later discovered you were wrong? What lesson did you learn from this story?